All right. Well, everyone, we will get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lisa Minoff. I'm at the Center for the Study of Social Policy, and we are just so excited about this roundtable discussion that we are having. The webinar today is entitled Compensating Care, How U.S. Policy Can Support Unpaid Family Caregivers. This webinar is hosted by the Center for the Study of Social Policy and Global Women's Strike and Women of Color Global Women's Strike. The Center for the Study of Social Policy is a nonpartisan national policy organization. We are recognized for our leadership in shaping public policy, reforming public systems, and building the capacity of communities to advance racial justice and promote the health and economic well-being of children, youth, and families. The Global Women's Strike is an international multiracial network campaigning for recognition and payment for all caring work. And Women of Color Global Women's Strike is an autonomous organization within Global Women's Strike who works alongside Global Women's Strike to campaign against racism, sexism, poverty, the unjust removal of children from their mothers by child welfare and militarism, and to campaign for a guaranteed care income, a child allowance, welfare as a right, and immigrants and asylum seekers' rights and justice for all. I want to thank Phoebe Jones and Margaret Prescott at Global Women's Strike and Women of Color Global Women's Strike for planning this webinar with us at CSSP. I am really looking forward to this conversation, which feels both incredibly urgent and timely. Caregiving is essential work, but that work, as many of us know firsthand, too often falls on individuals with little or no support from society as a whole. Today, we will be talking about what policymakers can do to better support caregivers. And it's important to note at the beginning that caregiving work really falls along a continuum from formal employment in the child care or direct care workforce, which is almost always low paid, to informal caregiving for family members or friends, which is almost always entirely unpaid. There's an interrelationship across this continuum of caregiving, because not only are many of the same people providing paid and unpaid care, but the poor working conditions and low pay or no pay at one point on this caregiving continuum directly affects people providing care at other points along the continuum. Ultimately, in order to effectively support all caregivers, we need to work creatively across a wide range of policy areas to ensure caregivers can meet their own needs. Over the last month, many of us have been in conversations marking Care Workers Recognition Month with a focus on the formal care workforce. And today, we want to shift the conversation a bit and focus on how to effectively support informal and unpaid caregivers. Before we dive into the discussion, I want to share what we know from the data about who provides unpaid care. According to nationally represented surveys, 53 million people provide unpaid care for older adults or children and adults with disabilities. Millions more provide unpaid care to children, especially young children. There are approximately 22 million children under the age of 6 in the United States, and 3 million of them are cared for by relatives who do not receive compensation as part of their regular childcare arrangement. Meanwhile, time use surveys show parents and other adults living with these young children, on average, spend 6 hours or more every day caring for them. It's important to note here the limitations of this formal accounting of unpaid care. The time use survey only captures the time that adults are actively caring for their children, such as playing with them or reading to them, or supervising their children while doing another primary activity, such as cooking or shopping. But as we all know, the work of a primary caregiver also involves arranging care for your children when you are not available, being there when your children are sleeping, and the endless deliberation and planning required to ensure your children's needs are fully met at all times. Women continue to do the bulk of caregiving work, and they provide twice as much of this unpaid care as men. And this is true across racial and ethnic groups, with the time use survey data indicating that Latina women in particular provide especially large amounts of unpaid care. A report came out just last week by Prosperity Now and Oxfam that details the disproportionate burden on women of color of this unpaid care. And I recommend it to anyone who hasn't looked at it already. This unpaid care work for children and other loved ones can be incredibly fulfilling to the person who provides the care, but it can also be emotionally and physically difficult work. And it exposes those of us who do it to economic hardship because of the limited supports available. CSSP took a look at the policies in place that can provide direct financial assistance to family caregivers in the United States and abroad. And the results of this research are available in a policy scan that we published in March and are available on our website. The US is famously an outlier for failing to guarantee paid parental leave to families who welcome a new child into the home. And it's the only country in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, to not mandate paid parental leave. And it's one of the few to do so in the entire world. But there are other policies and programs that provide care, financial assistance to caregivers in other countries that we don't have here, or that we have but are much more limited here in the United States. Whether we're talking about support for relatives providing childcare through the Child Care and Development Block Grant, or care for loved ones with disabilities, or long-term care needs through Medicaid, the important decisions in running these programs are often left up to states, including whether to support family caregivers at all. And there's paperwork and administrative burdens that make these programs difficult to access for many family caregivers, and payment rates for caregivers are often very low. In the case of caregivers in childcare, payment rates can run to $2 an hour. Meanwhile, parents and caregivers of color systematically are less likely to be eligible for or receive existing caregiving supports. So today, we are going to learn more about these gaps, and we really want to have a forward-looking conversation and gather insights from experiences providing care, from fighting for the recognition of care work, and analyzing public policy to think together about what supports we can and should be developing to bring financial and economic security to unpaid caregivers and value the work that they do. For this conversation, I am thrilled to be joined by Margaret Prescott. Margaret is a joint coordinator of the Global Women's Strike US and global coordinator for Women of Color Global Women's Strike. In the mid-1970s, Margaret co-founded Black Women's for Wages for Housework and is a founder of Every Mother is a Working Mother Network. She's also a founder of Give Us Back Our Children, which opposes the unjust removal of children from their mothers or primary caregivers. And she led the lobbying by the International Women Count Network that, with the support of 1,200 NGOs worldwide, won the 1995 resolution to measure and value unwaged work in the home and on the land and in the community. She worked with the National Welfare Rights Organization leaders, Beulah Sanders and Johnny Tillman, joining them as delegates to the first congressionally mandated conference on women held in Houston, Texas in 1977, when they won a resolution that opposed workfare and called for welfare to be called a wage. She is on the board of the National Welfare Rights Union and is on the steering committee of the Automatic Benefit for Children Coalition. Margaret raised her daughter as a single mother and is the author of the book, Black Women Bringing It All Back Home. And she wrote the introduction of Selma James's book, Our Time Is Now, Sex, Race, Class, and Caring for People and Planet. We are also joined by Philippa Laster, a certified nurse assistant and caregiver, as well as a seamstress and small business owner, a mom to a special needs young man and a young lady who at 12 years old became one of the youngest members of Global Women's Strike. Philippa is a volunteer with Global Women's Strike, Women of Color Global Women's Strike at the Crossroads Women's Center in Philadelphia. And she also works with Every Mother is a Working Mother. Philippa lends her voice to the support of paid and unpaid family caregivers and is advocating for parents of underage special needs children to be allowed to work as paid caregivers to their special needs children. We are also joined by Jane Welford. Jane is a 75-year-old grandmother of 2 boys and helps care for them after school 2 days a week and every other weekend evenings to let their parents unwind. She was a single mother on welfare in the 1980s before it was changed to require work. Last but not least, we are joined by Alex Kochia. Alex is a senior policy analyst at the Center for the Study of Social Policy, where he advances policies to ensure public systems work for children, youth, and families. Prior to joining CSSP, Alex was a policy consultant for the Children's Defense Fund of Ohio and a special assistant and analyst at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The format of our webinar today is a roundtable discussion. I, as moderator, have some questions for our panelists. And if you have any questions, please just drop them in the chat, and I will do my very best to get to them, especially particularly in the second part of our discussion today. So to begin with, I'd like to start with a question to Jane. Jane, could you tell us about the caregiving work you've done over the years and how your work as a caregiver has supported your own family and impacted your financial and economic security?
Hello, I'm Jane Welford. I'm a mother and now a grandmother of 2 boys. I've been a caregiver for my child, my friend, my mother, as well as my older sister. Now I'm helping to take care of my grandchildren. I was really lucky to have given birth to my son when Aid to Families with Dependent Children was still in place, AFDC it was called. It was a right rather than a forced work program, which it is now. The payments were too low, but nevertheless, at the time, it allowed me to leave an abusive relationship. It paid for the hospital for my son's birth and provided money for rent, food, clothing. This financial support enabled me to be with my son full time, to nurse him on demand, show him the beauties in the world. Caring for him full time during these first 5 years of life was so important. It strengthened our bond. Young mothers today don't have welfare as a right, as I did. Today, moms have to get a job outside the home and give their newborn baby to strangers to be able to get a little money from the government called temporary aid to needy families. When my son was 5, I began school. I started working house cleaning jobs so I could take him to school and pick him up after. After my son was grown and finished college and independent, I made a friend who'd been a nurse, she was elderly at that point, and was still very active in many struggles for justice. When she began needing more help, I was happy to be there for her. She was my heart mother. Her relatives urged me to become her caregiver within home support services in 2005 so I could be paid. I did and was in the SEIU Home Care Workers Union during that period. 2 years after this, my mother moved to California from the East Coast as she wasn't safe living alone. She had fallen and broken her arm. The other side of the duplex I was living in became empty, and my mother was able to move right next door to me, which was great. I had 2 years where I was taking care of 2 elders, a huge job, my friend and my mother. Fortunately, the difficult time with my friend didn't overlap with my mother's dementia. My mother was in pretty good shape at this time. Her memory loss wasn't bad then, but increased over the last 2 years of her life. That was very difficult. It was a lot of work to keep her safe and healthy, and I couldn't earn money. During these last 2 years, my sister, who was 13 months older than I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She moved down to be closer to me. I luckily found a place across the fence from us. We made a gate in the fence. I re-registered with IHSS so I could be paid for caring for my sister. Before she passed away, I took care of her as best I could, helping her to chemo appointments and making food that both she and my mother could eat. I later found out that Wages for Housework campaign, of which I'm now part, worked with what was then called the Home Care Workers Union to win pay for relative caregivers. It was a union and community effort. What a blessing. I developed my gardening skills and earned money as a gardener, work I still do as my Social Security is not enough to live on. When I became eligible for Social Security, the years I spent as an unpaid caregiver were not reflected in my payments. And when I was paid as a home care worker, the payments were low, so my Social Security is low. My mother had some resources which allowed us to be able to hire other caregivers when I needed a break, which for me was going camping in the mountains. This helped to keep my sanity. Too few family caregivers have this option because of lack of resources and because we're on duty 24/7. Now my son has two sons, ages 3 and 8. He and his wife are working so hard to make ends meet. They have a lot of stress, the rent's very high. They're trying to juggle too many obligations. It damages their relationship, and I'm doing as much as I can. I pick my 8-year-old up from school one day a week, and I pick up the 3-year-old now and then. I take care of both boys for evenings sometimes so the parents can get out. At these times, I can't do gardening work, which I need to supplement my Social Security income. Each month, I seem to get deeper in credit card debt. I would very much like to be able to do more, like take the boys to a movie now and then, or help pay for music lessons or sports camp, or take them camping in the beauty of nature. I do community work as much as I'm able. I practice yoga, and when a yoga teacher retired, he chose me to lead his gentle yoga for seniors at senior housing for a donation. I'm an active volunteer with the Global Women's Strike in the Bay Area. I stay connected to the world in all its terrible beauty as much as I can. I'm part of a planning group for guaranteed care income for low-income mothers living in San Francisco who are at risk of criminalization or losing their children to child welfare. It's a new pilot, although guaranteed income programs are growing across the country. Ours is the first that's a guaranteed care income. I also participate in marches, rallies, occasionally lobby our representatives to push for recognition and resources for family caregivers, and generally for more just policies. The work I do and have done over the years as an unpaid family caregiver, a low-paid caregiver, and a community volunteer are works that I believe are good contributions to society. So thanks for hearing me, you guys.
Jane, thank you so much for sharing all of that. And it really does show just how interconnected this continuum of caregiving is. And so many of us have done unpaid caregiving, but also various forms of paid caregiving. Philippa, you've also worked in the formal paid care workforce, as well as provided unpaid care. And we'd love to hear more from you about that experience and your experience with any supports for caregiving.
Yeah, I'm Philippa, and this is my story as a worker, as a caregiver, which I have to do both at home and outside my home. Like many women born and expected to be caregivers, I have worked as unpaid family caregiver. Like many women whose caregiving work done at home is not recognized as duties worth a wage, I have had to work outside my home as a paid caregiver. I'm a widow and a mom to a 20-year-old intellectually disabled and autistic young man, and a 14-year-old young lady who I homeschool. I'm exhausted, I'm worn out, but I keep going and I keep hoping. My unpaid caregiving job to my son includes assistance with ADL, physical therapy, speech therapy, audio and sound therapy, visual management therapy, sensory therapy, and every other life enhancement activities that a young man needs sometimes to exert his strength and give him a good quality of life. I want you to know that when other people come to my home to do the same job on my son, they get paid. And you should also know that when I go out to do the same job that my colleagues come to my home to do, I'm paid less. And the fact is that no one does all these various works I do with my son. It's like each one will have individuals doing them as a whole job, and they get paid for it. And those who worked with him for all the time only help him with his ADL. They don't go near the other therapists because these are seen as specialized jobs. My son is 20 years old now. He's just beginning to learn to brush his teeth. He's just learning to dress himself up because it's easier and faster for others to do it for him when they were working with him than to teach him how to do it. You might be wondering what I do as a caregiver outside my home. Just like I said, exactly the same thing, and sometimes just slightly different, depending on who the client is and what the client needs are. Why did I have to go work outside? Because that is the rules. The rule is that when I do it at home, it's not a job. But when I do it with another person's child outside my home, then it's a job. So I was told that I needed a job so my son could have services assigned to him to help him do the caregiving job, which I was doing, but which was unpaid. In other words, I repeat, it's not a job when I'm the one doing it. It's only a job when other people are doing it. And for my paid caregiving job, I'm paid less. And I've noticed that when I drive the clients to get groceries, I get written up for driving the clients in my car. I'm expected to park my car and go with a client on public transportation to get groceries. Errands are the ambiguous part of the task that I'm expected to do for the client. But appropriate compensation if the errands occurs outside the home of a client is never compensated. I walk around the clock and my health is suffering so much for it. I have high blood pressure, and I recently in 2020 escaped the devastation of a stroke. I'm still recovering from stroke. I'm still having to exercise my left side that was affected. I work so hard. Talk about pulling myself up by my shoestring, as expected. My average sleep time is 3 to 5 hours a day because I'm also trying to start a business at home so that I can properly educate my homeschool child. Something haunts me, and that's some memory. And I'll share that with you. I was once making a dress as a seamstress after coming back from a long hour of work, 12-hour stretch. And my table was to the wall. So which meant that my back was turned on the children. And my non-verbal autistic son was able to find a voice to say, turn around. He was 9 years old. And he said, I see, meaning I can now see you. I didn't take note that whenever I'm at home, I'm still working nonstop. And it took a 9-year-old then, autistic nonverbal child to find a voice to show me how so much I'm working. And the other thing he says to me is when he says, Mommy is busy. It's not because he's just acknowledging that I'm busy, but because he's feeling hopeless that I will not have time to do some things with him. These are my experience.
Philippa, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think it really illustrates not just the emotional toll that working so hard in so many of these different jobs that not all of which are recognized as jobs by government officials, but which are real work. The emotional toll that can take on you, on your family, and the physical and health toll that it takes as well. I want to take a step back at this point. We've just heard a lot about the experiences of caregiving for young children, caregiving for older children, caregiving for children with disabilities, caregiving for older family members and friends, and the range of support, some of which are helpful and some of which are not, for that caregiving. And I want to turn to Margaret, because Margaret is one of the leaders in the fight to have caregiving work recognized and to develop supports that to effectively ensure the economic security and well-being of caregivers. So Margaret, as we sort of think about these problems and begin to think about what some of the solutions can be, please walk us through some of the things that you and your comrades in the fight have fought for over the years to bolster the economic security of caregivers.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Thank you, Philippa and Jane and the entire team at the Center for the Study of Social Policies. This is so important to us, and everything that I say in terms of my part in this movement would not have been possible without so many sisters and brothers across the US and several other countries where the Global Women's Strike is based. Now, for decades, unwaged family caregivers have been waging an ongoing battle to have our work valued and paid for. In our open letter to governments for a care income, we say, quote, "In every day and in every emergency, unwaged or low-wage caregivers, urban and rural, mostly women, struggle to protect and care for people of every age and condition. The market values our work at $10.8 trillion, but never suggests that women should get any of it. Instead, we're advised to get an education and a good paying job. We, of course, have the right to that, but it does not deal with the indispensable work of life and survival, from breastfeeding to elder care. Only increasing the status, power, and income of caregivers can do that," end quote. That's what we're saying to governments. In 1965, Johnny Tillman, a president of the National Welfare Rights Organization, said, quote, "If I were president, I'd start paying women a living wage for doing the work we are already doing, child raising and housekeeping, and the welfare crisis would be over." Just like that. Housewives would be getting wages too. That's Johnny Tillman. Today, we call that a care income. Now, sadly, at the time, mainstream feminism did not recognize the welfare rights movement as a women's movement deserving of their full support. Meanwhile, in 1972, US-born, London-based Selma James founded the International Wages for Housework campaign. She supported the movement led by Black women in the United States for the right to welfare, as well as the universal right to family allowance in the UK. The first struggle of the Wages for Housework campaign in the UK was to defend family allowance payments to mothers, which the government wanted to transfer to men. They organized nationally and won. The government backed down. I co-founded Black Women for Wages for Housework, an autonomous organization in the Wages for Housework campaign in 1975. And immediately we were up against mainstream feminism who didn't want to know about our demand for money for mothers and other primary caregivers, but instead focused on careers outside the home. We, on the other hand, wanted a choice, the right to work outside the home or full-time in the home. One of the first campaigns we won was the right of students on welfare in the SEEK program in the City University of New York to be able to receive both student grants and welfare without either being cut. We stood with welfare mothers as they occupied welfare offices, demanding increase in cash payments and money for clothing, food, housing. But Organized labor, and again, mainstream feminism, along with social scientists like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, some may remember him, didn't see the point. And indeed, Moynihan famously said he, quote, looked up one day and women were working, end of quote. All of this is part of the history that led to the dismantling of welfare AFDC and its replacement as a mandated work program. And since that time, extreme poverty has increased and single mothers are the fastest growing population of prisoners. Women say they're not ashamed of what they must do to feed their children. In 1977, Alyssa referred to this earlier, at the first congressionally mandated National Conference on Women held in Houston, Texas, where I was a delegate, we worked with welfare rights leaders to win a resolution. I'll quote part of it. The elimination of poverty must be a priority for all those working for equal rights for women. And just as with other workers, homemakers receiving income transfer payments should be afforded the dignity of having that payment called a wage, not welfare, end quote. It also opposed work requirements. And we won because under the banner of every mother is a working mother, we got support from conservative women who dominated the delegations from the US South. Imagine that, a lesson we can learn for today. When we then took our case to the United Nations. During the UN Women's Decade at the 1985 UN World Conference on Women, with the support of some Global South countries, we won language on measuring and valuing unwaged work in the home, on the land, and in the community. In 1995, at a similar conference in Beijing, China, we won stronger language with the support of 1,200 NGOs worldwide, and even won the support of the Vatican, the Holy See, as is their seat in the UN. Our work has resulted in valuing unwaged work as a UN sustainable goal. Several countries began to work to implement the UN resolution, including Trinidad and Tobago, Venezuela, and Spain. Others have since followed. In the US, we worked with the Congressional Black Caucus to introduce and get bipartisan support for the Unremunerated Work Act, which resulted in the Bureau of Labor Statistics doing ongoing time use surveys on the time involved in the value of caregiving work. This data is available, and we urge those organizing for the rights of care workers outside the home to use that data. There's an interrelationship between unwaged care work in the home and low-wage care work when done outside. And today, we are pressing governments for a care income, sometimes referred to as a guaranteed care income for the care of people and the planet. We're supporting legislation put forward by Congresswoman Gwen Moore that calls for work to be redefined to include unwaged family caregivers, and for the earned income tax credit to be made available to them as well as to low-income students. We launch a global mother survey. We actively support reinstatement of the expanded child tax credit, and we support a permanent family allowance or child allowance in the US, but frankly everywhere. We oppose child welfare agencies removing children from their mothers or primary caregivers simply because the family is impoverished. We oppose the criminalization of poverty. We are working to scale up everywhere the soil regeneration movement initiated by impoverished women farmers in India, so critical to saving our environment. And finally, while money can be found for war and occupation, but not for resources for those of us doing the most essential work of society, caregiving, we have a call to invest in caring, not killing. We hope you will join us across movements and from the bottom up to collectively work for a society where the caring of people and planet is the priority. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Margaret. As you are walking through that history and the history of the fight to have caregiving work recognized and valued, I heard a lot mirrored in the experience that Jane talked through in terms of, the fight to have aid to families with dependent children available and accessible. to mothers in particular and parents in general, so that they can care for their children without any work requirements, without being forced to work outside the home. You also mentioned guaranteed income, the fight for a guaranteed care income, for a child allowance and a family allowance. And then Gwen Moore's bill around the earned income tax credit and having caregiving work recognized as work for the purposes of the earned income tax credit so that caregivers can receive the earned income tax credit. And these are all, of course, really important policy ideas that we should be thinking about, and we should be thinking about how we could advance these here in the United States. As we're kind of at this moment where we're thinking about what other policies we should be considering, I want to turn to Alex. And Alex, you did some research into and digging into the policies to support care work abroad, and particularly in Europe and other OECD countries. And I'm hoping that you could just tell us some examples of some care policies and caregiver supports that you think we should be thinking about here in the United States.
Absolutely. Thanks, Elisa. It's important that we can look at other countries and get good ideas that we can bring in. You know, other wealthy nations have a range of strategies to compensate caregiving, and oftentimes leading to more robust supports for family caregivers than we see here in the United States. Although there is a lot of variety nonetheless between the countries. Many countries, especially OECD countries, use a combination of policies such as tax benefits or generous paid leave programs. But another strategy is providing regular cash payments directly to caregivers through a care allowance. Germany has an especially comprehensive care allowance for caregivers of older adults or people with disabilities. Their long-term care insurance program is not means tested, and it covers almost the entire population. So informal caregivers can receive up to $980 per month directly, as well as other supports that are included, like training, like substitute and respite care, which we know are crucial for maintaining a strong and healthy caregiving workforce. One interesting model in some European countries is that the care allowance is provided through a formal contract with the local municipality, which actually formalizes the care and provides employment protections, although it also limits the flexibility of the care that can be provided and who's actually able to provide that care. In addition to these care allowances, some countries have child care allowances specifically to compensate parents and other informal caregivers for young children at home and when paid parental or family leave has been exhausted. In Finland, for example, families with children under the age of 3 have options of sending children to local public daycare centers, receiving an allowance to send their child to a private daycare center, or receiving an allowance for home child care, which is not means tested and provides flexibility on who the caregiver is. So there are a number of different strategies that we see and a range of use of those strategies. And you can read more. I'll put a link in the chat to the policy scan that Elisa mentioned at the top of our webinar, and hope that you all can take a deeper look into it and find it as a useful resource.
Thanks, Alex. Certainly when looking to think about what are some actionable policies that could be implemented right now, looking to what's already in place in other countries seems like the logical next step. I would love to bring Philippa and Jane in here because you walked through both some of the experiences with programs that provide financial support to caregiving in the United States, and talked a little bit about what you'd like to see, but I'd like to hear more from each of you about some of the policies that you think are promising to support family caregivers specifically and unpaid caregivers more generally. And so Philippa, I'll turn to you first. What are some policies that you'd like to see policymakers focus on?
First, I would like to see the lifting of the restrictions on parents of younger kids. If a child is not up to 18 years old in so many states, the parents are not allowed to work with that child. It doesn't make sense. The younger a child is, the more they need a parent. So that restriction should be removed. And also, I want it to be looked critically into, because when a parent who has a child that is an American citizen is not an American citizen, that child will not be given services simply because the mother does not have the particulars to show that she's working. She doesn't have work permit. And so that child will be deprived of all the services that the child will need simply because the services given to the child is based on what work the parent is doing. And not only based on the work, it's based on the work that the parent is doing outside the home. So I would like to see that restriction removed nationwide.
And that's such a great point, Felipa. I mean, one of the things you see with home and community-based services in Medicaid at the state level, as well as how states use CCDBG childcare funds, is that there are real restrictions on who can provide the care and be compensated for providing care. So many states don't allow parents of minors to be compensated for providing care, even if those minors have special needs, and the agency would compensate other people to provide care for those children. And so kind of loosening some of those restrictions are really important. And the point around immigrants' access to family to benefits is just crucial. Jane, I'd love to turn to you to learn more about your recommendations, about what you'd see like to see policymakers focus on.
Well, even though the AFDC was really good for me and my son, that a lot of people had a lot of problems with it. You know, it was very invasive to a lot of people. I was really lucky, probably because of the color of my skin, and other than maybe the state I was in, I don't know. But so I think the guaranteed income pilots that are really growing around the country are very promising. And so building on that and a guaranteed care income for the caregiving workers seems like a really good way to push right now. You know, so far it's local, like cities doing it. Some, I think maybe some states are doing it, but some, I think it needs to be federal. So I think all of this guaranteed income stuff is pushing to have it be federal, finally grow enough to be that. That's my thought.
Yeah. And Jane, can you tell us a little bit more? You mentioned you're involved in a pilot in San Francisco. Can you tell us a little bit more about that pilot?
Yeah, it's for single mothers who are at risk of criminalization or losing their children to child welfare. And it's going to be a pilot for just 10 women for a year. And hopefully it could be extended, but it will be, because San Francisco is a really expensive city, it's going to be for $2,000 a month, which should help a lot of women. So yeah, that's been an inspiring work. A lot of work too.
I can only imagine. I mean, many of the pilots you see offer something closer to $500 a month. But so 2,000 is significantly more support. And it will be really interesting to see what that means for families who receive it. And I'd like to open this up to Margaret and Alex as well, as we're talking about policies. We heard about Felipa talk about reforming existing policies like Medicaid, and Jane talking about guaranteed income for caregivers, as well as the guaranteed income more generally. What other policies should we be considering? Margaret, please jump in.
Okay, I'll go. You know, you mentioned, Alyssa, that I raised my daughter as a single mom, and I was happy and grateful to have access to the WIC, program, and hope to see that expanded. But also the 20 plus years that I spent raising my child full time, as I was doing campaigning and organizing work as an unpaid volunteer, not reflected in my Social Security. And that's something, it's shocking that under Social Security, they're called our 0 years as though we were doing nothing, only the most essential work, raising the next generation. So I think that's an area that we have to look at. I think also in the area of child welfare, for example, I mean, there's an epidemic across the country where we see particularly Black children, also Indigenous and low-income children generally being removed from their families, not, as I mentioned in my talk, not because of abuse, but because they conflate poverty with neglect. So we are pressing again, and this is policy. I think Gwen Moore has some related legislation to this, because we know that those mothers or primary caregivers, grandmas increasingly raising the next generation, having their hands on some cash helps to keep that family together. So the family is not traumatized. So that's another, policy area. Of course, we want to see Congresswoman Gwen Moore's bill taken up a lot more about the earned income child tax credit, because that is the first legislation I've seen that actually redefines work, that says unpaid family caregivers are workers and therefore should be eligible in putting it together with, with students. Another thing that I've heard some Congress people, Ro Khanna and some others in the Progressive Caucus discussing is the money for childcare can either go to the care of a child, or that family or that mother could raise the child full-time in the home, right? And get that kind of support, to have that kind of choice. And I think from what Alex, you could remind me that there may be at least one other country that's doing that as well. So obviously, the care income. And I just quickly also want to say about the work for the environment. It was very important for us, even back then during the UN Women's Decade. We were fighting for not only the care in the home, but also the care work in the community, the volunteer work in the churches, et cetera, that women are doing, but also the work on the land, which is so vital and so important. So that's another area, looking at where resources are going for women and to small farmers, and in particularly into that movement for regenerating the soil, and so important to the planet right now. So there's quite a lot there, but really important. And of course, the permanent child guaranteed child credit or family allowance. Thanks.
Margaret, that's great. And I think just your point at the end around we need when we think about care, so often we're thinking about care from one individual to another, but there's also care for community and care for environment, and there's other forms of care that we can be thinking about as we think about compensating work that is really important and currently undervalued and undercompensated. Alex, Margaret put you on the spot about asking about other policies in Europe. What else would you like to put on the table?
Well, I definitely echo, Margaret, what you said about making sure that the time spent caregiving counts for the purposes of public pensions. And I saw that there was a lot of chat discussion about that as well. Most OECD countries provide that type of support. France, for example, has 3 different types of Social Security credits for caregivers. One is means tested. One just reduces the number of quarters of work that's necessary to receive the full pension benefit. And then one boosts pension benefits for people with 3 or more children. And that was an effort after World War II to actually boost birth rates. But all of these credits are available regardless of marital status, which makes it a lot more equitable than the current Social Security spousal benefit in the US. And the only other one that I would highlight, just to think about flexibility for caregivers, balancing different responsibilities, is a number of countries have statutory rights to work part-time for care reasons, although a lot less than half of the OECD countries who do provide that also provide an automatic right to revert to full-time hours when the caregiving timeframe is up. But nonetheless, that part-time flexibility is really important when we think about US caregivers combining part-time employment with their caregiving responsibilities. So there's these other models that we can look to as well.
Yeah, and actually, Margaret, you mentioned using childcare funding to pay for parents to stay at home, and that was actually something that a couple of states did experiment with in the 1990s. There was an at-home infant care program in Minnesota and Montana. And this is a time before states were really implementing state paid leave policies. And what they effectively did with childcare funding in those circumstances was use childcare funding to enable parents to stay home for a period with their children before going back to work, who were not eligible for paid leave through their employers. So that's certainly something that we've tried in the past. I know that was part of policymaking conversations in the 1990s around welfare reform, and it's something that should certainly be considered as we're looking into the future. I was just scanning the chat and the Q&A. If you have any last questions, pressing questions, audience, please drop them in the chat. Make sure we can see them. Jane, I did notice a question in the Q&A specifically about the organizations that are involved in the San Francisco pilot that you're working with. Do you have that information, or could you share it with the audience?
Well, we are working. Global Women's Strike is partnering with the Prostitute Women's Safety Project, and funding it comes through the Department on the Status of Women in San Francisco.
Oh, that's great.
And of course, women of color in the Global Women's South, of course, also.
And we can share information. We will be following up the webinar with the recording and sending those to registrants, as well as resources, and we can share more information about the pilot that Jane mentioned. I see a lot of support in the chat for the experience you've shared and the policies that you each have recommended. Before we wrap up at the top of the hour, I want to just give each of you a chance to talk through. We've talked a lot about guaranteed income, about using existing policies like Medicaid. We've talked about Social Security and sort of reworking Social Security so that caregivers, as they age, can have some security and they don't experience those 0 years. And as Alex mentioned, there are examples abroad that we can look to. Are there other supports in addition to cash that we should be thinking about for caregivers? And what would you like policymakers to focus on right now? I'll turn to Margaret first.
Okay. Well, first of all, there's legislation right now that Congresswoman Gwen Moore has put forward. And we work closely with the Center for the Study of Social Policy, who with us organized a very successful congressional briefing last fall. And we're really hoping to build support for Congresswoman Moore's bill that, as I said, redefines work, right? And calls for the earned income tax credit and a modernization, as she calls it, of the earned income tax credit. There are a number of things that we have already mentioned, so I won't necessarily go to those, but also to say that this is a time where we see a care industry growing that makes a distinction between caregivers outside the home, focuses on caregivers outside the home and sort of sidelines family caregivers. We think that coming together, and we want to make an appeal, the coming together of those who are working for the rights of care workers outside the home with those of us who are family caregivers, because we do know the interrelationship between the two. And we don't want one to be used against the other. Mm-hmm. And we're also worried that this care industry, while focusing on profit, figuring out, especially with the baby boomers coming in place, figuring out how to limit pay and the rights of those are care workers, and aren't really concerned about caring relationships. I didn't get to say too much about that, but that is so important because we have to think of the person who's being cared for, right? And what are their what are their needs, and what, and having a caring relationship as opposed to one that's just based on profit. I'm sure there are a couple of things that that I am leaving out, but I'll just leave it at that for now. Thank you.
That's great, Margaret. And I see in the chat, as we're talking about what other supports families might need, Jasmine mentioning specifically mental health supports, other supports for families, as especially those who may have experienced child protective services supports as they reunite. And I'd love to turn it to Jane and then Philippa. And any last words for the audience about what you think should happen moving forward and what you would like policymakers to focus on?
I'm not sure what else to add. I know caregiving can be a very isolating thing to be doing, because you're focusing on somebody's needs and it takes a lot of time and energy. So I'm not quite sure. I mean, just getting the recognition and the pay for the caring work is huge, and finding some way to do that would allow carers to get the help that they need to keep doing that work without wearing themselves down. Yeah.
And Jane, you talk so much about you provide respite care in a sense to your children now as you care for your grandchildren, and you benefited from respite care. And that was also something that Alex mentioned that sometimes comes along with caregiving supports and sometimes does not. There was a question in the chat that I'll work into our final round. If there are any things in terms of compensating care that you think we should not do, would be interested in those thoughts as well. So Philippa, I will turn the floor to you.
I have to acknowledge, first of all, the person that talked about mental health. We have all heard about PTSD, and it's all over the world, PTSD. I have coined out another word for parents of children on the spectrum or special needs, or people that take care of family members who have disability. I call it ongoing traumatic stress disorder, because it's never ending. I know I'm not going to have opportunity to say post-traumatic stress, but it's ongoing traumatic stress. I will like to see those in authority not just telling us that, okay, these are the caregiving jobs that are jobs, and these are the ones that we're still going to hold on to and not consider as job. But if they are going to give us tax credit, or if they are going to do anything, because this, whatsoever go to mothers always go back to the children. Whatever they give to us should please be on monthly basis, every month, not at the end of the year. Children grow on daily basis. We need the extra for the groceries. We need the extra for the dance classes, for the bowling alley, all those things that will make the children's life better every month, please. That's what I have.
That's a great point. And that was certainly something we saw during the pandemic. The value of the monthly child tax credit was huge for parents and caregivers, and really helped them pay the bills, which, as you say, they come monthly. They don't wait till the end of the year. Alex, concluding thoughts as we reach the top of the hour about how to better support caregivers and what policymakers should focus on now.
I would just echo the investments in respite care and making sure that that is something that is always combined with the economic and the financial supports. It seems like that's something that a lot of folks in the chat also feel, and models that we see again in other countries like Australia, who are investing in that type of caregiving support.
Well, thank you. And I want to take a moment to thank each of you, Margaret, Philippa, Jane, Alex, for this wonderful conversation. I know that you've been getting lots of praise in the chat, but this has really been a really sort of galvanizing conversation. And I'm hoping, I know people in the chat have said, we hope we do more of these, and I would love to do that too. And we would really love to work together, not just our two organizations, but with each of you in the audience, to try and think about how we develop some of these policies to better support unpaid caregivers and to work on implementation in the years ahead. As I mentioned, we will be sending along the recording to this webinar once we have it. We also will be sending some of the resources that have been shared in the chat, along with links to CSSP's policy scan. And I want to note just before we end, I think this was shared in the chat, but Global Women's Strike is doing a webinar very soon on May 11th to share their findings of an international survey they conducted. And the webinar is entitled "What Mothers and Other Caregivers Want." So more interesting conversations ahead. Thank you all again for joining. And thank you, Jane, Alex, and Philippa, and Margaret for being here.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank
Thank
you
you.
all.